Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldron. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, August 25th, 2017. A banner day. Happy birthday to our own Armando. Armando, he's probably drunk already, wandering the streets. Is the worst possible day for a birthday. Of course, it interferes with my own. Well, I think we discovered this last year and then discovered last year that we had discovered it the year before and forgotten. And that's because with each passing year, we are less and less capable of remembering such important dates and important facts. And what's the point, really, anyway? Why remember anything? Why should anybody have any kind of memory? Donald Trump is president. Apparently, he is on a rage tweet tear this morning. I am not up to date on what he's been grousing about entirely, although I did see a fantastic retweet from Simon Malloy, who usually has these things dead on. I guess one of the first things he started yelling about this morning, pardon me, was about how the stupid Republicans won't get rid of the filibuster rule, which isn't a rule, but we'll give them a pass on that. It's Twitter. If they would just get rid of the filibuster rule, then they would be able to pass so many more bills, and as things stand, few things can be passed. 8 Dems control the Senate, as he says. And then Simon notes that he wanders off to watch 10 minutes of cable TV news and then comes back with the comment that few, if any, administrations have done more in just 7 months than the Trump administration, which he abbreviates as just capital A, period. Few, if any, administrations have done more than in just 7 months than the Trump administration. Bills passed, regulations killed, border, military, ISIS, Supreme Court, SC, I guess. It doesn't mean South Carolina. Big wow. Of course, the contrast is startling. Congress stinks. If they fix the filibuster, they'll never pass anything. Congress hasn't done a damn thing. They're so terrible. No bills have been passed. Watch some TV for 10 minutes, come back and say, what was I saying again? Oh yeah, all right, how great I am. Yeah. Oh, I've passed more bills than any administration ever. He still persists in believing this because he's a demented idiot and belongs in a long-term care facility rather than in the White House. That's just the bottom line of it. And then I guess he continued on, in between, while watching the TV news, I guess. Let's see. I'll see if there's anything interesting in this one. Who knows? General John Kelly doing a fantastic job as chief of staff. Not keeping your phone away from you, but okay. There is tremendous spirit and talent in the White House. Don't believe the fake news, which says that even more people are resigning. Did read last night that the guy whose job it was to compile the so-called propaganda document, the compilations, daily compilations of favorable headlines, good news, and even pictures of him looking strong on the television, that Donald Trump demands be delivered to his desk twice a day, not just once a day, but twice a day. Doggone it, he's good enough, he's smart enough, and people are paid to deliver good news to him twice a day. That guy quit. And I don't know, some people thought that was actually a hard job, I guess, trying to find good news and favorable headlines about Trump. But I think it's probably the easiest job in the world. Just make stuff up. There's no point. Why wait around for headlines? Just type something in and say it was a headline. Start your own website. Call it, whitehousenews.com and make up your own headlines. Then print them out. He won't know the difference. And honestly, will anybody? I ask you. Seems like a simple job to me. But maybe he grew a conscience. I have no idea. Let's see, what else is he ranting about? Blah, blah, blah. Nick Adams retaking America. Best things of this presidency aren't reported about. Oh, that's good. Convinced this will perhaps be best presidency ever. I'm sure that happened. Nick Adams apparently fell down the stairs this morning and hit his head, and then wrote a book about it. And the last thing I noticed, strange statement by Bob Corker. I don't know what Bob Corker's statement was, but Donald thinks it's strange, considering that he is constantly asking me whether or not he should run again in 2018. Tennessee, not happy. I didn't notice that Tennessee was unhappy as I passed through the other day. They seemed pretty with it to me. But anyway, yeah, I don't know what the statement was. I don't really care. It doesn't make a difference. What struck me obviously about this thing was, what a strange thing. Donald Trump is weirded out by somebody who's constantly asking for praise and approval from his peers, followers, what have you. What kind of a damaged guy constantly has to have that sort of praise lavished upon him? What about if he's the president of the United States and has nuclear weapons? That might be a bad situation. Anyway, I don't know. He's just, he's off his rocker, and we're not going to try to put him back on it either. I say we just make off with the rocker and keep it for ourselves. Daily Kos Radio, in case you didn't know what you were listening to, is live now. Thanks to Bill in Portland, Maine, for reminding me that that's true. Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, wonders if maybe he should have stayed on vacation until January 2021. That is likely true. I certainly thought about that. Although, I have to arrange for a better sort of vacation. Next year, you're all in for it next year. I'll have reruns available for that if necessary. I was worried about running reruns, not only because people don't really like reruns, but also we didn't have our station identification breaks built in there, which probably would have been a huge treat for many of you who are tired of these things. And I guess one day we'll reevaluate whether this whole thing is worth anything and whether we should just abandon the idea of simulcasting on terrestrial radio so that we can say nasty words on our podcast, or at least not worry about it when other people do. But I have a feeling, there's a lot of potential in it. And boy, people in Rochester, of course, you could get the podcast and you could listen to the live stream. But yeah, I know you like listening to your radio too, and it's not a bad thing to get stumbled upon once in a while by people wandering around the radio dial saying, I'm looking for something other than Rush Limbaugh. What do you got? Anyway, let's see. Oh yes, look at that. And that's some nice birthday wishes also coming through from Bill. We'll have he sent us a chocolate cake emoji. It's the very best chocolate cake emoji in the world. Believe me, I think it's the most delicious. It's the sort of thing I would sign away the sovereignty of my own home nation in exchange for. That's, of course, what, I don't know, somehow Donald Trump believed that the Chinese were going to do that. This is delicious cake, and so I don't care about the national security of China. I'll do whatever you want. But he's not a very smart guy. All right. Let's see. What other fun news is going on? Or, as the case may be, not so fun news. Things we put away in Pocket yesterday that require some discussion. Oh, yes. I did have this message from listener and Daily Kos user Blue Mississippi. That must be tough being blue in Mississippi. But, in all these states that we think of as red states, there are huge pools of blue, and they're usually being gerrymandered out of existence. But don't abandon those people. Blue Mississippi is still hanging in there. This is an interesting theory. This came through, about 10 days ago on the 14th when I was trying to run out the door and get ready, have all my things ready for vacation, etc. And so I missed it at the time. This is got no basis in fact whatsoever, and I don't even care. It was just good theorizing. Trump at the time had returned to Trump Tower for the first time since his inauguration, and we all were wondering a little bit about why that was happening. There was the story about renovation taking place at the White House, and I'm sure some renovations were in fact taking place. I don't know if I would trust any renovations done by this Russian puppet. I would assume that the next president would be well advised to tear that White House apart, especially the Oval Office. But you never know where but Trump has he does have a proven proclivity for planting bugs and cameras and such, and eavesdropping, apparently a favorite activity of his in Pervalago. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some presence left behind. But of course, he did have that meeting, and I don't know that it wasn't about decorating tips or perhaps even proper recording device placement for the Oval Office. He met with the Russian ambassador and foreign minister right there. And I mean, he spilled state secrets while he was chatting with them. So I don't know that the discussion wasn't about where do you think the microphones ought to be so that you can get the best read on me so that you know you should keep paying me and whoever else might occupy this office afterwards. I wouldn't trust that thing as far as I could throw it. And I found out I cannot throw the Oval Office very far at all. It's really bulky. You try it. Anyway, Blue Mississippi's theory was that they went to Trump Tower specifically. I mean, he could have bugged out for Bedminster, as he did for most of the time, or anywhere else. He could have checked in at Mar-a-Lago, even though it's closed, but he could have checked out the property. He could have gone anywhere. He's got a Westchester, New York golf property, too, which I guess, I don't know whether he doesn't have a bungalow there, but he didn't spend any time there this time. Blue Mississippi's theory, though, that it was Trump Tower specifically where he went, as he's guessing here, in order to destroy evidence because of the FBI raid on Manafort's house, and that it spooked him, and he said, I got to get back to the tower and shred some stuff and burn some stuff and just clean out some files and get rid of this stuff so that if the FBI ever comes calling at Trump Tower, and I assume at some point they will, they won't get a hold of, I don't know what, the P-tape? I don't think he has a copy. But maybe he might have requested a copy. That is a possibility I hadn't considered. But of course, no basis in fact. I have nothing that illustrates that there's even suspicion of destruction of evidence of any kind by Donald Trump or anyone associated with him who is in Trump Tower. But I think it's true anyway. That's all. And in this day and age, who can hold it against me? Honestly, you got bigger fish to fry if you're worried about fake news. Take it elsewhere, I say, and leave me alone. I want to make stuff up about Donald Trump. Besides which, most of the stuff that we make up is largely true because it's based on all sorts of rumor and anecdotes and also overt behavior. So I'm not too worried about being too far off the mark on that one. Let's see. Wanted to bring that up and credit it for at least fun discussion material. And let's see, there's a bunch of things I put together yesterday, and then a number of things that I had from days before that I thought might make worthwhile discussion, but not all of which could fit in yesterday's show. Let's see. Let me go down the line here and see what we've got. Oh, yes, we did have that story about Trump angrily calling Republican senators about the Russia scandal. That reminds me, one comment about his tweet this morning about Bob Corker's comment that I saw fly by, and I don't know that it's necessary I go and retrieve it, but somebody did say, yeah, that conversation that he alleges takes place, or that series of conversations in which Bob Corker is constantly asking him whether he should run again, probably never took place, and it's very likely that it did not. However, I wonder whether the kernel of truth as it exists in Trump's mind is whatever conversation he had with Bob Corker that was cited in that story I mentioned yesterday. Remember that Trump keeps angrily calling Republican senators about the Russia scandal. Corker's name pops up there. In a late July phone call with Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, Trump complained about a bipartisan bill that sanctioned Russia for interfering with the 2016 elections while making it tougher for Trump to lift the sanctions. The bill was overwhelmingly supported in Congress by both parties and was signed into law earlier this month. He was clearly frustrated, a source familiar with the call told Politico. Then that's really the end of the discussion with respect to Bob Corker. But in Trump's mind, his fevered brain, that could be what he's talking about with the constantly asking me, by which I would guess he means he never actually asked me that. I just thought he should ask me that. And every senator running for re-election should ask my permission to run again, and I will tell them whether or not they should win. And I think he really believes he should have that control as president, not by virtue necessarily of being president, but by being the leader of the Republican Party. Though I don't know whether he separates things that finely in his mind. Okay. So we got that story. We also had the one about no rides on Air Force One unless you vote for my bill. Yes. Here's another thing I wanted to bring up. I mentioned yesterday that there was a New York Magazine piece by Jonathan Chait that was headlined, "That Russian guy who attended the Trump Tower meeting is almost definitely a spy." Now, I think everybody already believed that, but I had a nice comment yesterday from listener Robert Turner, who I'm going to try and give you his Twitter address so you can follow him, but it's one of those ones with 1,000 numbers. They probably mean something to Robert, and so he could rattle the name off very quickly, but I think he might acknowledge that's a lot of numbers. Robert Turner is Robert T 262-53781. That's it's a mouthful. It's a little difficult. But anyway, he made an interesting observation, I thought, because I am constantly in need of praise and affection, just like Donald Trump. Maddow's intro, that would be Rachel Maddow's show last night. Maddow's intro last night, he says, me, covered it weeks ago in more depth regarding the Russian hacker spy in Trump Tower. KITM rules, and I was happy I'll accept that. KITM rules, I believe it does. And I said, well, thanks and woohoo for us, but acknowledged in the tweet, as I often do, because you have to. I only knew about it because some other enterprising reporter did a good job documenting the evidence on that, and all I did was read it, and that's all Maddow is doing too. And likely Rachel Maddow has the same problem that we've got, although even more acute, too many stories and not enough time to report them all, and so she's finally gotten around to this one, and maybe Jonathan Chait's piece prompted it. Although I am amazed every once in a while how often we find a piece of news, and again, I'm not reporting it. I'm not sniffing this stuff out, so I can't really take credit for it, but I don't know. I think there's something to it, and Daily Kos readers do this all the time. That's why Daily Kos is like getting the news early. We have a good eye for what's important, and it takes the rest of the traditional media sometimes a little bit longer to pick up on the story because they too have to make editorial decisions. But it's always exciting when you see something that you picked up in one or maybe two reports, spoke with your friends about, and then see it amplified a couple weeks later. It makes you look good. It's nice. But I didn't discover the story. Jonathan Chait didn't discover the story either, I don't think. But we're glad for his amplification of it. A month and a half ago, the New York Times obtained emails in which Donald Trump Jr. set up a meeting in Trump Tower with Russian officials who were promising him sensitive information on his father's opponent that would help the Trump campaign. Do you remember who his father's opponent was? It's not necessary that she be brought up. I like that he skips over this stuff. Ordinarily, I'd be frustrated at reading on his father's opponent, Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State, and blah, 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 former First Lady from living in Briarcliff Manor, or wherever they live in New York. I forget where they live. What's the name of their town? I don't know. I think it's near there. Anyway, that didn't happen in this story. I inserted it in this story. What am I doing? Yes. A few days later, it emerged that the meeting also included Rinat Akhmetshin, a figure whose name was not included in the first stories about the meeting, but who is a key figure in the meeting because he is almost certainly a Russian spy. Today's Times, and that would be August 21st. Today's Times has a follow-up story on Akhmetshin. I should read it, but I'll just read his follow-up on the follow-up, with 3 reporters sharing a byline. The story does not call Akhmetshin a Russian spy because that is not a charge that a newspaper can prove, short of extraordinary evidence like an email from Akhmetshin saying, by the way, I'm a Russian spy. And that email does not exist because, unlike, say, Donald Trump Jr., Akhmetshin is not a complete idiot. That also was not reported in the New York Times, but we thank Jonathan Chait for adding that bit. Instead, the headline cautiously calls Akhmetshin a lobbyist who has a web of Russian connections. And maybe he's that instead of a spy, but he's probably a spy. Really, honestly, almost everybody who's here on official business from Russia called upon to spy, and vice versa, I'm sure, in many situations with the United States personnel. Well, they're not supposed to spy. They don't want to break into things and steal state secrets, but if you observe something of importance, you report it. But the point here is Akhmetshin is doing much more than that. Or so it is alleged, by Jonathan Chait, anyway, and me. But this massively understates the story's conclusion that he is simply a lobbyist. Donald Trump has a web of Russian connections. Akhmetshin is, again, almost certainly a Russian spy. The shadiness of Akhmetshin's cover story comes through over and over in the report. Akhmetshin, quote, told some journalists that he worked with a military counterintelligence unit, but said he never joined Russian intelligence services. Unlike his father, sister, and godfather, the Times reports skeptically, he founded a think tank, and that is in scare quotes, with the ostensible purpose of promoting democratization, but which was in reality, quote, essentially a vehicle to burnish the reputation of one client, Akizan, Akizan Kazageldin, a ex-KGB officer, like Putin, and the former Prime Minister of Kazakhstan. So I guess that means I should have known his name. Meanwhile, Akhmetshin's resume contains gaping voids. And here's some clips, I guess, from the New York Times story. A trained biochemist who speaks 4 languages, he described himself on one official document as a house husband. Well, he's that too. He identified himself as the head of a Washington think tank for years after it was officially dissolved. Okay, that's more problematic. And maybe he is a house husband. He's just an egalitarian when it comes to gender roles in his household. I don't know if he's married or not. We should applaud this as progressives, don't you think? Well, there you go. Job done. Chait continues here. His explanation for how he ended up in the meeting is just a tad bit suspicious. Now, that's going to be troublesome. That, I'll admit, will be difficult to explain. Here, the New York Times says, Mr. Akhmetshin, a Washington resident, so he was just walking by. Oh, no, this was in New York. That's right. He was on the Acela, and he heard, he saw in the bathroom for a good time campaigning call Don Jr., so he did. Mr. Akhmetshin, a Washington resident, has told reporters that he just happened to be lunching, there we are, with Miss Veselnitskaya, remember her, in Manhattan that day, because he's from Washington. And he was like, I'm hungry. I need some Manhattan clam chowder. And you can't get that in a can at the supermarket. So I'll go to Manhattan and get it. By the way, is there anyone, I'm not a New Yorker. Are there places, could you be walking around saying, boy, do I want some Manhattan clam chowder? I will go to a famous lunch spot that always has the best if you want really good Manhattan clam chowder, like there's places like that for New England clam chowder, right? And I know of at least 3 kinds of clam chowder. Manhattan clam chowder, is that like, it's always on the menu at the Ritz-Carlton or the Waldorf Astoria or something like that, some kind of iconic hotel where they always have it? Just curious, because that might be what Akhmetshin was after. He was lunching with Ms. Veselnitskaya that day when she spontaneously invited him to the meeting with the president's son-in-law Jared Kushner, and Mr. Manafort. He did not explain why she wanted him there. I guess we'll pause to say the Manhattan clam chowder is probably the most likely part of all of that, and it's not even in there. I made that up out of whole cloth. Why would anyone believe that a meeting that took such machinations to set up, I want to give him this information. I forget the name of all the various actors, but we're talking about the developer and his son, who's the singer, who are friends of Donald Trump's and Donald Trump Jr.'s from Moscow, Miss Universe days and possibly before, have this information, and on behalf of somebody else, they want to get someone else, a third party, a fourth party, a fifth party, to go and have this meeting and deliver this information, but they need to go through the guy who's the entertainment music producer guy from England. Goldstone, was it? I can't remember everybody's name offhand. I need a roster. They go through him. He manages the singer kid, and he goes to the meeting, and they bring in Veselnitskaya and the other one, the translator, and now Akhmetshin and all. He just happens to be there. And remember, they're going to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr. and the campaign, top campaign staff for Donald Trump, who is by that point under Secret Service protection. So I would imagine in order to get into Trump Tower and go up the elevator to the Trump offices floors, you got to get through Trump security and the Secret Service. I don't think there's any drop-ins for that stuff. That's why it was never plausible when Donald Trump Jr. said, oh, I don't know the names of any of the people who were coming to the meeting because no one ever told me. That seems pretty ridiculous all by itself, simply because I can't imagine you would be able to get into the building without identifying them and having Don Jr. or someone connected to him give a list of names to somebody at a desk somewhere about who's allowed in and who's not. Anyway, he claims he was just having lunch with Veselnitskaya, which is just something he does when he's in Manhattan, because reasons. And she said, hey, why don't you drop by? I didn't tell anybody, and I'm not going to tell you why you're going. I'm going to a meeting. It's important. It's with a guy who's running for president and his son and his top campaign aides. Why don't you come with me for unknown reasons? And he said, this chowder is crap, so I might as well. I guess that's apparently how it went down. Well, I guess now is as good a time as any, because there really is no other time, for us to take our first station identification break. We'll be back with more after this. And we're back from our break. Thanks for rejoining us here at the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. I just need one moment here. I'm going to let the music run for a second while I retweet this very funny video GIF meme sort of thing to the rest of you so you can all enjoy it. One of those endless loops of Donald Trump that zooms in on itself and then becomes another picture of Donald Trump, except he is eating a taco salad out of his own skull. I thought that was well worth sharing and delaying the show in order to share with you. And I think if you're following on Twitter, you will agree. I don't know. Probably not. Okay, let's see. We'll address some of the comments, by the way, that came in during the last segment before continuing on. And, oh yes, I'll need to bring up some other news about this here. Let's just make sure I've got it handy and available. But Gideon was asking, why is it that we keep saying that Daily Kos or reading Daily Kos is like getting the news early? And the answer is because we are bragging about how good our coverage is. Well, here's what I mean. It's the same thing that I was explaining before. It's not that we are reporters who dig up our own stories, although that does occasionally happen. That is definitely true. But more often than not, we are culling the media. And, well, you know what? The answer really is given by our next commenter here on our KITM hashtag. It's not surprising, or it is not surprising. That's the name under which, he or she, let's see, is tweeting. I can't, can I get some indication of here? Let's see. I think she. Thread and Thumb is the actual, Twitter handle, Twitter address by which she tweets. I'm guessing. I'm not really certain, but I hope so. I hope I've got it right. I hope I have just, that's a phrase I'm hearing from my kids now. My youngest son, apparently this is the hot thing. I don't know whether they're serious or they're being ironic about it, but apparently kids these days say to one another, did you just assume my gender? And I feel bad because, well, there are serious issues swirling around that, and you shouldn't be joking about that, kids, but there has to be some room for levity, and, well, I hope they're well within the safe space of levity there. But it's a good question. It's a serious issue. I am assuming gender, and it's because I don't have the language tools available to me yet and internalized to deal with these things. And I get caught flat-footed by 40 plus years of English training to use gender and assign it even when not necessary. But it is explained herein by thread and thumb. I feel that KITM, Kagro in the Morning, finds the vein of truth within the mainstream media, MSM. More importantly, KITM reports it before MSM. And again, technically speaking, it is usually impossible for that to be the case because I am reading it very often in mainstream media, although sometimes in online publications that venture out a little further into a story before the real giants of mainstream traditional media catch on with it and report it, meaning the network news, the news weeklies, and the giants of the newspaper world. But very often I'm reading things in those very same publications. And I guess what Jonathan Chait is saying here is what ends up happening. They report on the facts that they can establish and stand behind, and it's up to the rest of us to do the reading between the lines. And a lot of times that's what goes on at Daily Kos, where people read these things and say, clearly the New York Times is being very cautious, overly cautious in avoiding calling Mr. Akhmetshin a spy, and that might even be a wise thing to do. But the rest of us feel compelled to go ahead and say it anyway, and so New York Magazine does it. I do it. People on Daily Kos do it all the time. I guess what ends up happening, the reason we end up thinking that it's like getting the newspaper early is, well, reading these stories in the mainstream traditional media press, well, sometimes that requires waiting until their giant Sunday editions, and they make a big deal, all capitals, or capitalized there to show the formality of it. They officially make a big deal nationally out of the story that non-news junkies will then be clued into because they only consume some certain regimen of news. News junkies will have been clued into it perhaps a lot earlier. And it makes it seem like getting the newspaper early. And, of course, newspapers, they publish once a day in the morning. So, for instance, you and I get the news that something has happened as it happens. We discuss it, and by the time a story is filed and published and is delivered in the next morning's newspaper, it's old hat to the rest of us. But at Daily Kos, it's been written up and reacted to again 2, 3, 4 times in the front page and in the diaries, such that by the time the rest of the world picks up the newspaper from their driveway in the morning, did I say driveway? Well, driveway, in case I did. By the time they catch on to the news or hear it on the morning news radio on their drive to work, we've already discussed it. It's like getting the newspaper early. I do think we do tend to spot information in the stories that either the traditional publications are timid about highlighting, or we spot something that's being talked about, obviously, in the traditional media because that's where we read it, but doesn't really blow up into a huge deal until 5, 6 news organizations are reporting on it nightly on the evening news broadcast and each morning and the headlines of their flagship newspapers. It's like getting the news early, but it's not really getting the news early. It's in fact getting the news late because we're only talking about what we read somewhere else. I do like to bring that up from time to time, but I also do feel like readers of Daily Kos and I hope listeners of Kagro in the Morning feel like they are well prepared and conversant in the news by the time their non-news junkie friends and acquaintances think to bring the topic up. That's sort of the whole point usually of the Friday show, that you'll be conversing with people over the weekend, perhaps, who aren't as ravenous in their consumption of news as you are, but you'll be well versed in anything that breaks through with them. By the time it breaks through with the main body of traditional mainstream media news consumers, you've thoroughly digested it. That's not my doing. That's not any one person's doing at Daily Kos. It's not even the doing of the staff of Daily Kos. It's not limited to Daily Kos as a blog. Other blogs do it too. It's done everywhere. Everywhere news junkies get together, digest the news, and talk about it. But this one is ours. We like it best. That's what I say. Let's see. Gideon says, sends me a link to something at Daily Kos. Prediction that speech controversy would be fatal to Trump. Let's see. Which one are we talking about? David Neer's July 19th, 2016 prediction, I guess, which didn't come true. So yeah, it's also like getting bad news or news that wasn't actually reported correctly early too. We do get things wrong. It's not that we're super geniuses and only pick up on stuff that definitely does become mainstream news later on. We do make the wrong call from time to time. Why Melania Trump's plagiarized speech should be fatal to Donald Trump's campaign. And I don't know. That's good weasel word right there. I'm all for weasel words where you can find them. Should be fatal. It should have been fatal to Donald Trump's campaign. It just wasn't, because Donald Trump's campaign was never about telling the truth or being an honest person. So I guess that's out. Anyway, I hope I've explained myself well there. I have other things that I need to go back and explain as well, apparently. Let's see. One last comment here. Michael Musson says, have we learned Trump's Secret Service code name? Because I think that would be a fun hashtag war. How about a Game of Thrones themed, Little Hand, right? That's been out there. I don't know if we ever did find out what it was. And I don't know if the Secret Service really cares if anybody finds out what it was. And they usually use the same sort of names over and over again. But I don't know. And very often Eagle is part of it because reasons. And I am guessing that we're talking about Rotund Eagle or Flightless Eagle or Enormous Oaf Eagle, possibly. Could be his Secret Service code name, but I think they like to keep them shorter than that. One last comment here. Gideon says, are you saying that Daily Kos highlights certain existing news? Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what we are essentially doing. It's certainly what I admit to doing here on the show. I don't know how else you could describe it. That's not very exciting. That doesn't make anybody feel good about having read Daily Kos. But I mean, the bottom line of it, the truth of the matter is, you can't sit there and say at Daily Kos or Daily Kos Radio, we predict the news or we report it first. That's clearly never going to be true. I tell you every time where I'm reading this stuff, and I tell you every time when I'm speculating about things that have no basis. Now, that could turn out to be true. You know, that would be like getting the news early for real. If I tell you Mike Flynn is a spy, and then it turns out later on Mike Flynn is a spy, but it's speculation when you do that. Anyway, Gideon says he comes to Daily Kos mainly for the news, so it's cool to me. And I think that's probably where, I don't think anybody who comes to read the news at Daily Kos thinks that we are in fact predicting what's going to be in the next day's newspaper. What we're doing is talking about news as it happens, and our, ability to publish at any time is what gives us the ability to create the illusion that we are giving you the newspaper a day early. We are talking about things that are going to be in tomorrow's newspaper that weren't in today's newspaper in the form in which we're discussing it. That's usually true. But it's just a function of the fact that newspapers are stuck publishing once a day in the morning. And though they now publish online, you will likely find those stories online in the evening. But even so, it takes them a lot longer to turn their stories around if they're on national events that we have all observed happening. So whereas we can publish our first impressions of the news that was covered by the mainstream traditional media outlets. I only saw the news about the earthquake. Hypothetical. There's no earthquake that I know of going on at the moment. But I saw it on television, and I saw that Donald Trump said, what we need to do to help the people who have suffered from this earthquake is dump boiling oil on them from helicopters. Okay. Like, that's not a good idea. And I would write a story, or in my case, speak on the radio and say, you ought not to dump boiling oil on earthquake victims, nor anyone else, really. It damages their skin, very likely would kill them. And that's kind of the opposite of what you ought to be doing as president. Whereas Donald Trump thinks, oh, I should be exterminating the American people. This is a great idea. This is why they elected me. And I disagree. And then people would say, in the morning, the following day, when they picked up the newspaper and they say, and it says in the headlines, outrage, Donald Trump murders millions of earthquake victims, people will say, that I feel like I have heard before. You know what? They're so sharp over at Daily Kos. That's where it was. They told me that yesterday. It's like getting the newspaper early. And in that sense, it is. But it's not the sense that we are sniffing out news and reporting it before working journalists. Right. But, working journalists too, right? Like tomorrow's new, it has to, even if they publish it tonight online and then it makes it into the print edition tomorrow, the New York Times has to say, Mr. Trump, who admittedly is not a physician or dermatologist and might not necessarily know that dumping boiling oil on people, whether they've survived an earthquake or not, is a bad idea. May not have been briefed by White House Chief of Staff John F. Kelly, Mr. Kelly, how they might refer to him, et cetera, et cetera. They have to hedge their bets. And whereas we say, of course, he's a giant idiot and he dumped boiling oil on people because he's a sadist and a prick. I can say that, and we'll get to press earlier than the New York Times on that one. Tomorrow, I guarantee they won't say he's an idiot and a prick. They might come around to it in the opinion columns weeks later, but at that point you will say, gosh, I feel like I've read this before. It's like getting the newspaper early. Not the news, the newspaper. Different. And that's the way we usually say it, actually, is that it's like getting the paper early. I think that was the original formulation of it. Anyway, let's see. We'll go back to the funky story about the Russian who showed up at this meeting, almost certainly being a spy. If I can find my way back to it, here it is. Look at that! It's in the New York Magazine, but in the Daily Intelligencer column. I guess that's Chait's column, and so the tab that I have open here has a DI in it. I was looking for a New York type logo, but instead I found the DI. Okay, so where were we with this? He is claiming to the New York Times that he went to lunch with Kushner, Manafort, or he went to lunch with Veselnitskaya, who then said, come to the meeting with Kushner, Manafort, and Donald Trump Jr., but I'm not going to tell you why. And he said, I'm done with lunch. Why don't I go along? Everyone wants to meet Jared Kushner. Okay, Donald Trump Jr. That would have been a draw at that point. So, back to Chait. There was a lot of traffic in DuPont Circle that day. What? And long story short, he wound up in Manhattan. There you go. Got hungry for lunch, coincidentally ran into another Kremlin agent. Well, they all ate at maybe the same restaurants. And then, oh, hey, how are you? Fine. I'm about to have a clandestine meeting with the son of the guy running for president to give him dirt on, he thinks I'm going to give him dirt on Hillary Clinton, who, by the way, is his opponent in the general election and former Secretary of State. I don't know if you know that. Very few people know that. I don't know if you ever heard that, but I just heard that. And why don't you come along? Really? You have dirt on Hillary Clinton? No, I actually want to talk to him about Russian adoptions, but why don't you come with me and do that? I don't know anything about Russian adoptions. That's okay. We're also not really talking about that. Okay. Let's go. As soon as I finish my clam chowder, we're out of here. That's the idea. That's the story he's selling. He's in Washington, based in Washington, finds himself in Manhattan. That does happen a lot. Hungry for lunch, daily. Coincidentally ran into another Kremlin agent. That could happen a lot. He goes to the Russian tea room or something. Or, the Russian-only McDonald's on 45th. I don't know. And decided to tag along to a meeting in Trump Tower. Anybody who you got a free pass to Trump Tower? I'm going with you. It's a tourist spot. It has been previously reported, Chait says, that Akhmetshin hacked into the emails of a firm his clients were fighting in court. I did tell you that, but only because I read somebody else's story that said so. Today's story documents a second attempt at hacking. The first hacking case, which has not previously been reported, began when Mr. Akhmetshin served an alliance of businessmen led by Suleiman Karimov. Maybe that's Karimov. The vagaries of Russian pronunciation are lost on me. He is a financier close to Mr. Putin, who isn't, in a commercial and political dispute with a Russian competitor, Ashot Egayazar. Wow, what? Egayazarian. I've mangled the hell out of that one. You can read it for yourselves. In early 2011, two London lawyers, this is still the New York Times reporting here, two London lawyers on Mr. Egayazarian's, my best guess, his team, separately received suspicious emails and hired forensic experts to scrutinize them. Good eye, guys. According to people involved in a Scotland Yard investigation. That's you, Gideon, you guys. The experts found that the messages concealed spyware meant to infiltrate their computers, and they fed traceable documents into the spyware that were then opened by computers registered at, that's a good idea, the Moscow office park of one of Mr. Karimov's companies. Wow. Of all of the facts in the Russia scandal, this one seems the most underplayed. Email hacking is one of Akhmetshin's basic methods of operation. The Trump campaign met with a Russian spy who is known for pulling the exact kind of crime that was committed in this case. That's all we really needed to know. Why didn't we get right to it? Well, Jonathan Chait has a flair for the dramatic. Now, I did see a comment earlier saying that, whose comment was it? I'm trying to dig through this, but somebody did say, I feel like maybe Akhmetshin isn't necessarily a really good professional spy. Wouldn't he be like lower profile than that if he were really a professional spy, as opposed to inserting himself Forrest Gump-like into everything happening with Russians everywhere? And maybe that's outdated spycraft. I don't know. Maybe Russians these days, or the ones working to ingratiate themselves into Trump world, they've come to realize you can be as flashy as you want, and the flashier the better. One, because Trump. Yeah, here it is. Michael Musson had said this one. But Michael, you forgot the KITM hashtag. I had to scroll all the way back. But it may be that they say, well, Trump likes flash. And maybe if there's even a brain in his head, he'll think, but what if this guy is a spy? And then he'll come to the conclusion, no, I don't think he's low profile enough to be a spy. And maybe that's part of the cover. I couldn't possibly be a spy. I would not be this obviously Russian if I was a spy. I don't know. It might work on him. Michael, though, was the one who said it about 25 minutes ago. He's too visible to be a real spy. He seems to be more an independent contractor spy. He's a U.S. citizen now and can be charged as a traitor. Ooh, that's a good point, probably. Double agent? Sure, why not? You'd have to get the goods on him first, but not here. We can just say he's a spy here. Just come right out and say it. It's like getting the indictments early. That's the way it works here. Well, but that's a good point. And an independent contractor spy, I think that seems to be more along the lines of the way these guys are working these days. An awful lot of the people that were caught up in this story are dual citizens, and it's kind of disappointing. And it ironically raises some questions about our immigration policies that aren't being raised by Donald Trump's approach to immigration. It appears, though, that we have a fairly significant problem with national security matters thanks in part to some, hopefully very small subgroup of Russian American immigrants. But the problem exists and ought to be acknowledged. And if you can ban people from Muslim countries on the 1% doctrine, surely you should be able to do the same for Russia. But golly, we're not doing that. Okay, so that's the end of that story there. I think we've hit the highlights of that piece. Canadian pundit Brian telling us, by the way, he comes to Kagro in the Morning and Daily Kos for the comics, which we do have. That is not a joke. It's a huge vertical for us, and most of the recent years' winners of the top political cartooning prizes actually run their cartoons in the Daily Kos cartoon vertical. I don't know if you know that, but it's true. And that's because, well, the cartoonists all know one another, and the really good ones, honestly, are liberal leaning. There's a huge problem in conservative comics and conservative humor in general. They're just terrible at it. Maybe conservatives actually do get belly laughs out of that stuff. I don't know. But it really just doesn't seem to cross the aisle at all. That kind of humor it's too forced and too overtly political. I'm sure they think the same thing of liberal humor. Anyway, the point is, good cartoonists, they know one another, they know who's good at it, and Tom Tomorrow, who has put that vertical together, knew exactly who he should be trying to entice into publishing at Daily Kos because they were good, and no surprise, he actually put together a roster that year after year after year wins top prizes in political cartooning because they're all good too, and he knew it. They really are. I would say that is definitely something you could legitimately come to Daily Kos for and stay just for the cartoons. But while you're there, try to read the news too. It makes the cartoons funnier, actually. All right, there's more news. I haven't mentioned the fact that there is a gigantic hurricane bearing down on Texas. I don't have a lot of news about that one. It's huge. It will come ashore as a very powerful hurricane. I don't think it's going to come ashore at the same magnitude that, say, Katrina did, but the size of the thing and the amount of precipitation it will bring with it is said to be of unprecedented scale. It's going to wash Texas away, or at least the Gulf Coast of Texas. It's gone. Finished. I saw some crazy numbers with respect to the rainfall that they were anticipating. So crazy that I can't repeat them because I am just not sure I read them correctly. I mean, it was like 3 feet of rain. I don't know how you get that. I guess a hurricane would do it. And, I mean, nobody here, I'm going to guess, believes that Donald Trump is equipped to deal with this. There is no FEMA director, by the way. I don't think he even tried to name one. No chance that such a person would get through Congress anytime soon because there's just too many people awaiting confirmation. And they all suck, by the way. They're all unfit for their work, but they get approved nonetheless because there's no opportunity to filibuster anymore on those nominations. Sorry about that. But we knew it was coming. We just didn't know that Donald Trump was coming. And, well, there's very little chance that people are going to come through this hurricane, with enough preparation to, in many cases, survive. And in fact, now this I should look up and grab a story on because I couldn't believe it when I saw it flying by on Twitter yesterday. But apparently the immigration services and border patrol, do not plan on lifting their enforcement of immigration checkpoints on Texas highways during evacuation for the hurricane, which will, of course, mean that many millions of full-fledged American citizens are left in danger because of the huge backups on, just plain old evacuation with no checkpoints is usually a terrible experience and clogs the roads and leaves people in hours and hours of traffic. If you're going to also have a checkpoint there, it'll only make things worse. And of course, even worse than that is that people who are afraid that their immigration paperwork either doesn't exist or is not in order, or they might think, I'm just going to get thrown in the clink because I am Hispanic, and even though I am an American citizen, I'm a fourth-generation American citizen, they're not going to believe me. They're going to throw me in the slammer here and be in jail for the hurricane. There are people who are undoubtedly refusing to evacuate or are afraid to evacuate because they're afraid of being picked up wrongly or rightly by immigration. So that's a pretty enormous problem all by itself. And never mind that even with efficient evacuation, the idea that the Trump administration would be able to efficiently deal with a natural disaster of any magnitude, particularly of this magnitude, is about zero. So that's causing some concern, I'm sure, down there in Texas. But then again, there are other people who say he knows how to handle a business. He runs a huge, huge business. And so, thank God, we have a businessman in the White House who will be able to handle this situation. Well, I have my doubts about that. You probably do too. If you're in Texas, best of luck to you. Keep us up to date. Tell us how things are going. And but wait for after the break, which we're about to take right now. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. And let's see, bringing down the music, we can get back into the mainstream media news reports that somehow you might have missed to this point. But now that you hear them read on the radio, they become official news. And then you can consider yourself informed early. I'm sure that many of you have already read some of these stories, as a matter of fact. Although the show does give us the opportunity to bring up a few things that you might have missed along the way, or things that you set aside to read later, but never got back to. Let's see, where should we go with this one? A couple of really interesting things to follow up on, and I'm making my choice as we speak. There is pressure on Manafort grows as feds track more income and possible money laundering. That's a report out of McClatchy's D.C. Bureau. I feel like they don't get enough attention, and they really hit the nail on the head frequently and early. And here we amplify their message, and then you'll see it reflected elsewhere, perhaps over the weekend. The person who really deserves the credit for this one, Peter Stone, writes under that headline, Paul Manafort's place in the crosshairs of special counsel Robert Mueller's probe into the Kremlin's attempts to sway the 2016 presidential election seems to be growing more uncomfortable. Two sources familiar with the inquiry tell McClatchy that investigators are working to confirm information indicating that Manafort and the consulting firms he led earned between $80 million and $100 million over a decade from pro-Moscow Ukrainian and Russian clients. This part we knew, although the number is bigger than we thought, I think. Mueller's expanded focus on Manafort's complicated financial picture is zeroing in on whether he may have evaded taxes or engaged in any money laundering schemes, the sources say, and the hunt for his financial records through a labyrinth of offshore bank and business accounts has become an important prong of the investigation. Overall, the probe centers on whether anyone in Donald Trump's campaign, anyone, or other Trump associates, assisted Moscow's election meddling. Russia's cyber mischief last year was designed to help the real estate mogul win in November, but Mueller's team may also pursue any matters, and that's in quote, any matters that are found in the course of the probe. Manafort, who chaired the Trump campaign for 3 months in mid-2016 and earlier spent 2 months coordinating the search for pro-Trump delegates, is a prime target as investigators attempt to win the cooperation of key members of the campaign's inner circle, said the sources, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the inquiry is confidential. So what's going on here? Essentially, I mean, if you were a little bit disturbed, as I was, I had a little alarm go off that seems to say, all right, well, what Manafort may have been engaged in was wrong, but does it mean that he was conscious of or in any way assisted Moscow in interfering in the elections such that Trump would win? Because after all, wasn't he hired to help Trump win? Is it a crime not to accept the help of Russian agents. That would, of course, be a crime. But is it a crime to say, I want this person to win for president? I've been hired to help this person win for president. It may be that others are also trying to help him win for president. It may even be that those people are people with whom I have some other outside association, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I know what they're doing in this case or am helping them do it. We don't really know what his knowledge of their activities was. What's happening here is, because Mueller's team has the prerogative to pursue any matters found in the course of the probe, my guess is that they think that there is, in fact, a link. But even if there isn't, they probably feel justified in saying, well, if I can come up with solid evidence of money laundering or tax evasion by Manafort, whether it comes from Russian sources or not, I've got a charge I can bring against him, and I can use that as leverage. If I think he has actual information about Russian interference about which Trump is aware and with which he was colluding, if I think Manafort has that information and think he won't otherwise give it to me, and I am able to say, well, even in a completely unrelated matter, I have pretty strong evidence that you evaded taxes, and I have an authority to pursue that and can get to the point where you find yourself charged with tax evasion. Would you like to avoid that, or I could help you arrange to avoid that or minimize the impact of it, even if it has nothing to do with Russia? Now, if it has something, if it's coming from the same people who are also manipulating the campaign and he has some idea that that's happening, or even if he doesn't, it's just that much worse, and you can threaten him with that much more. The president will be in trouble on this one. He won't be around to help you. You're going down for tax evasion, possibly even for money laundering. One way out of this is help us cut this investigation short. We are pretty sure that Trump knew about and colluded with Russian efforts to impact the election. If you know about that and can tell us that and point us in the right directions and save us time and money and expense in ferreting that out for ourselves, well, then we could do you a favor perhaps on your tax evasion or whatever else it is that we found on you. And, it's a tactic that's used all the time by prosecutors. I don't love that one, from a moral standpoint, because I feel like, if you got me on tax evasion, fine, it shouldn't really matter that you found it accidentally when you were pursuing something else. But the idea of saying, oh, you're a tax evader, we should be putting you in jail, but we're going to let you out of jail because I really want to jail this other guy, I'm not in love with that one. I don't know anybody who would be, except other prosecutors, I guess. Anyway, Manafort, who chaired the Trump campaign for 3 months in mid-2016 and earlier spent 2 months coordinating the search for pro-Trump delegates, is a prime target as investigators attempt to win the cooperation of key members of the campaign's inner circle, right? And they got that from sources who spoke on condition of anonymity. Given his pro-Kremlin connections and his closeness to the campaign, Manafort was uniquely positioned to play a role in any collusion between the campaign and operatives working on behalf of the Russian government to help elect Trump. Whether Manafort can be squeezed depends in part on whether he failed to report foreign income and overseas bank accounts annually to the Internal Revenue Service as required by law. The volume of money said to be involved and the time elapsed could put him at significant risk. If Manafort is shown to have violated the tax laws and the disclosure laws in connection with his foreign income, then he may be facing substantial jail time and large fines, said Jennifer Rogers, a former federal prosecutor and the executive director of Columbia Law School's Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity. If the violations are willful, the penalties go up. That's the sort of pressure that could cause Manafort to cut a deal with Mueller under which he might receive leniency in return for divulging what contact he and other Trump aides had with Russian officials and operatives during 2016. Based on my experience with prosecutors, it would be typical that they're getting financial information to pressure Manafort to cooperate in a bigger case, said former Justice Department prosecutor Barak Cohen, who is now a lawyer at Perkins Coie in Washington. Is that right? Coie? Armando probably knows. C-O-I-E. Very big firm. Don't really have any reason to say their name out loud often, so I'm not sure. And I'm never sure about anything. There's been no indication to date that Manafort is spilling the beans to the feds, but clearly the heat is on. Last month, although many Manafort bank and business records previously had been subpoenaed, FBI agents raided his home in Alexandria, Virginia, seeking more details of his finances and turning up the heat. He also has a place in Trump Tower, I think. Does he not any longer own that? In order to conduct the raid, prosecutors had to obtain a search warrant by showing a judge probable cause that criminal evidence would be found at the house. Cohen noted that the special counsel's office could have used a grand jury subpoena or tried to obtain the records from Manafort's lawyer. The use of a search warrant signals prosecutors were concerned evidence might be destroyed. Aha, Blue Mississippi might be onto something. This month, Bloomberg reported that Mueller has recently used a Washington grand jury to send subpoenas to some international banks for records about Manafort accounts and transactions. Earlier this year, subpoenas were issued for other Manafort bank and mortgage records in the U.S., including some relating to millions of dollars in mortgages and loans Manafort received after he abruptly left the Trump campaign in August. Other Justice Department, it says other Justice Department this year also obtained records for about 25 foreign bank accounts and businesses that Manafort used in Cyprus, a popular money haven for Russian oligarchs, and also main base of operation for our current Commerce Secretary. Whatever. Besides looking for hidden income and accounts, much of this activity is part of an effort to document signs that Manafort may have been involved in money laundering. People knowledgeable about the probe say investigators are looking intently at whether the millions he received from oligarchs and politicians came from corrupt sources, as well as his purchase of, almost a decade ago, of 3 homes in New York and Florida, in addition to Alexandria, I guess, including a $3.7 million condo in Trump Tower for almost $8 million in cash. The biggest problem Mr. Manafort faces is that these transactions, taken as a whole, are suggestive of either money laundering or tax evasion or both, said Washington attorney Ross Delston, who is a money laundering expert. He's an expert about it. He's not a great money launderer himself, I wouldn't think. Mr. Manafort's multi-million-dollar real estate transactions present a rich target-rich environment for any law enforcement probe. Money laundering charges, of course, would heighten Manafort's interest in flipping and cooperating with investigators. Anyone facing serious charges for money laundering and tax offenses involving undisclosed foreign bank accounts would have huge incentives to trade cooperation for prison time, said Jonathan Weiner, who was the State Department's top money laundering expert during the Clinton administration. The growing legal pressure on Manafort was underscored further when the once high-flying foreign consultant abruptly switched attorneys not long ago, right after his home was raided, hiring Kevin Downing, a partner at Miller and Chevalier. Downing's expertise is in tax and money laundering issues. There's a lot of them out there. He previously handled such cases in a senior position at the Justice Department. So maybe he knows Jonathan Weiner. Mueller has added individuals with international tax expertise, and Mr. Manafort is adjusting his legal team accordingly. So he's watching what players are being subbed in on the other side and bringing players of his own. From there, we kind of go into a backgrounder on what his financial ties are and what Mueller is looking at. Now, let's briefly go over some of that. Mueller's team is also scrutinizing Manafort's participation in the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, which we just mentioned in the previous story. What's more, government investigators are looking at information they've received concerning talks between Russians about using Manafort as part of their broad influence operations during the elections. The New York Times first reported earlier this year that the investigation had obtained intercepts of Russian intelligence and other officials discussing the possibility of using Manafort in an effort to influence Trump's views. He denies it, of course. 4 U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that the Kremlin did, in fact, sponsor a massive cyber operation aimed at helping Trump win by hacking into computers used by the DNC and, of course, John Podesta as well. Manafort made a fortune working in Ukraine from 2004 to 2015 for a mix of pro-Moscow Ukrainian oligarchs and political figures, most notably ex-President Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted and fled to Moscow in early 2014, and Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, a billionaire with good ties to Vladimir Putin. Manafort had a $10 million a year contract to provide business and political advice to Deripaska that was signed in 2006 and ran for a few years, according to the AP. Manafort also had long-standing business dealings with pro-Moscow steel mogul Rinat Akhmetov, Ukraine's richest man, and Manafort's first client in the country. Manafort also had ties with Dmitry Firtash, who also has been in the news recently, who made billions in energy deals with Russia. U.S. authorities are trying to extradite him at the moment on separate corruption charges. That's why he's in the news. Most of the payments to Manafort did not have to be and were not disclosed to the public. This year, however, after inquiries from the Foreign Agents Registration Unit at Justice, Manafort filed a late registration as required by law for lobbying and consulting work he did from 2012 to 2014 in Ukraine and Washington for Yanukovych's Party of Regions. Manafort's registration showed that his firm received over $17 million from the Party of Regions, which historically was underwritten heavily by Firtash and Akhmetov, according to two sources familiar with those payments. Manafort's sudden departure from the campaign last August 19th came after a New York Times story about a secret ledger in Ukraine disclosing that he had received $12.7 million off the books from Ukraine's Party of Regions for a 5-year period, a charge that Manafort has flatly denied. But he denies everything flatly. Everything he does flatly. There's more, by the way. Just by way of background points on this stuff, I wanted to get back to this for a while. This is a piece from Talking Points Memo in their Muckraker vertical, written by Sam Thielman. Why did a Russia-friendly Icelandic fund want to invest in Trump projects? Back to Iceland. When reporters combed through the Panama Papers last year, Sam tells us, they recognized a familiar name cropping up, the FL Group, a now-defunct Icelandic bank that in 2013 had been accused in a lawsuit of developing a scheme, ultimately never realized, to avoid $250 million in taxes on a $2 billion investment in real estate projects, many of them tied to President Donald Trump. How weird. The bank began as a holding company for two airlines based in the little Nordic nation. Well, we're going to ruin their pronunciations, I'm sure. Flugfelag, F-L-U-G-F-E with an accent, L-A-G, Flugfelag Islands, and Iceland. I said islands because it's I-S-L-A-N-D-S, but it's probably Iceland. And, wow, ready? Loftledthir. I don't know where. We emphasize that. So, Flugfelag and Loftledthir. Leithir. There we are. Maybe that's it. Wow. Okay. So that's hence the name, the FL group, Flugflag and the Loftledthir. Until 2005. So it started as a holding company for the two airlines. And then in 2005, it became its own financial institution with a surprisingly large number of Russian clients. It's again, the financialization of everything. MBA culture that ruined the world, essentially. A holding group for two airlines. And then they had a big pot of cash and they figured out, well, rather than just let that cash sit here for a rainy day to buy more aircraft or pay union contractors to fix our planes or whatever, let's take that pile of cash and play financial games with it and try to get huge returns on risky investments. And if we lose, maybe our government will bail us out. Didn't work that way for them. But anyway, after 2005, they started, I guess they probably decided, let's spin it off, because why keep the exposure for the airlines? The airlines are doing okay. or maybe they weren't and they wanted to be separated from the holding group. But at any rate, they made some business decision to spin it off, and it became the leading equity fund in Iceland, according to James S. Henry, former chief economist at McKinsey & Company and a reporter for the Panama Papers Icelandic Working Group. The FL Group was one of a number of Icelandic banks with surprisingly deep ties to the Russian billionaire class ascendant in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet system, according to Henry. The wealth of the post-USSR oligarch class was so directly tied to the Icelandic economy, in fact, that Russian President Vladimir Putin offered $5.4 billion to bail out Iceland's banks during the global financial crisis, though the deal never went through. The Icelandic Bank managed to seal a 2007 deal to invest $50 million with the developer Bayrock Group. Yes, remember them? A firm run by two men convicted of stock fraud in the 1990s, Felix Sater and Salvatore Loria, alongside a former Soviet official named Tevfik Arif. We remember those names. A former finance director at Bayrock. Imagine the finance director turning these people in. Jody Chris is too corrupt for the finance director of a development group. Amazing. Jody Chris sued the company in 2010 for allegedly misrepresenting Sater's role, though the complaint remained sealed by the court until 2016. In an interview with Bloomberg, Chris said another Icelandic bank called, offering a counter-investment to FL Group's proposed $50 million, and Sater and Arif told him to stick with that firm because it was, quote, closer to Putin. How interesting is that? I guess, by the way, this takes us back, or maybe gives us an entree to wonder a little bit more about why it was that Iceland, we all sort of, I guess progressives sort of celebrated Iceland's decision in the the worldwide economic collapse that was brought about in this country by the mortgage security crisis, and all the bank bailouts, but we all applauded Iceland's decision not to bail its banks out and to say, to jail their banksters and let their institutions fail. And I don't know that they were really in the same position as we were. American banks, I think, could very likely have taken down a lot more with their failures than Icelandic banks. Money's money, of course, but, or maybe it's simply, ethnocentrism. Well, we can't have America go down here, but Iceland, screw them. Maybe that's just it. I'd prefer to think it was something else, but maybe that's all there is to it. But I wonder if maybe it wasn't necessarily so much a principled decision of, no, let people suffer the consequences of their risk-taking, let these institutions fail, and we'll jail these people because what the hell else are we going to do with it? What if the issue really was, well, we would have bailed them out, but, we don't have the money to do bailouts that the United States government has to do bailouts, for one thing. But for another, the only source of the funding necessary to work a bailout like that comes from Russia. And in fact, really almost personally from Vladimir Putin. And we're a sovereign nation here in Iceland. We can't sell our economy to Vladimir Putin. That would be extraordinarily dumb. Whereas here in this country, we might have done that. And very likely right now with Donald Trump as president, we almost certainly would do such a thing, whether we needed it or not. Maybe it was just that Iceland knew well before we did how dangerous Putin really was and how capable he was of inserting himself into democratic institutions in the West, even through, I don't know, maybe somebody would say a seemingly benign offer like helping a bank. But who helps banks? Especially if you're Vladimir Putin, you know that it's not going to be the case. I wonder if that could put a very different spin on Iceland's decisions. I mean, it's equally wise, but it might not necessarily be. Well, on principle, we approach our economic issues this way. You are responsible for your losses. We will not bail you out. Versus, we would love to bail you out, but it would come at the cost of mortgaging our sovereignty, and we're not going to do that. Interesting. Anyway, so back to Bayrock. The $50 million payment was unusual. Which $50 million are we talking about again? Icelandic bank managed to seal a deal in 2007 to invest $50 million with Bayrock. That was unusual, to say the least. According to Chris's complaint, FL Group bought 62% of the profits from 4 Bayrock properties, which was the developer's entire stake. These properties were a development called Waterpoint on a blighted 20-acre property in Whitestone, New York, that Bayrock had agreed to detoxify, which probably means, we'll take this distressed property at a way, way discounted price, but because we'll do the toxic remediation here, we'll buy it at a discounted price, remediate the property, and then build it and develop it. And if you sell something like that to an honest broker, they'll be able to turn a profit, perhaps, but it would be pretty difficult. They'd have to be able to get a pretty good price on that detoxification work. If you sell a property like that to Felix Sater and Salvatore Loria, I think we all understand what that means. They'll move trucks in and out of the property. People will be directed to walk around wearing masks, to shovel some dirt, and then they'll just say, we remediated the property, and then they'll start building, and everybody will be sick with cancer if they live in that property because, they're mob guys. They don't have any intention of actually remediating the property. The scam is they buy at a discounted price, pretend to remediate, maybe even bill Superfund EPA for the cost of the remediation, and then walk away from it. But I don't know. I'm just alleging these things. What does Felix Sater know about toxic remediation? Anything? Does anybody know? Anyway, so FL Group was also connected this way. Let's retrace the steps here. They paid $50 million to Bayrock in exchange for which they bought 62% of the profits from these 4 properties. They bought all of the income, the rights to all of the income that Bayrock was supposed to get out of Waterpoint, Trump Soho, a Trump Tower in Phoenix, Arizona. Did that ever come together? Did Trump visit it after the rally? Anything like that? And the Trump Merrimack in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Did that exist? I don't know. I know he had a failed project in Fort Lauderdale, but maybe it wasn't this. The deal would have left FL Group with profits from the 4 properties, but structured the investment as a loan. That way, the firm could avoid taxes on the dividends and call them contingent interest, a process Henry described as asset stripping. That process is so complex and the offshore finance rules so arcane that all Henry would say was that it, quote, has been illegal. It's a deal Trump would have had to sign off on, and sounds like the sort of aggressive dealing that he would be very happy with. I think it's been illegal, but also some people have gotten away with it. Okay, let's try it. Chris charged in his lawsuit that the deal was illegal and that both Bayrock and the FL Group were fully cognizant of that fact. The suit alleged that Bayrock and FL Group also colluded to keep the deal secret from other firms that had worked with Bayrock on its various projects and agreed to pursue as much as $2 billion more in the future on more projects. From this lawsuit, there is this excerpt. The exchange was part of a larger deal whereby Florida became Bayrock's FL. I'm used to seeing that as the abbreviation for Florida. FL became Bayrock's new partner. By the way, a partner that owns 100% of their expected income from these 4 deals, but maybe they have other deals. The new partners agreed to work together on existing 4 projects and on so much of the $2 billion worth of new projects as they might agree to develop together later. All of this was to the exclusion of plaintiffs and other minority members in the subs who should have shared the millions of dollars of the $50 million and a share of the new projects. Oh, so Chris thought he was getting cut out of the payments. It wasn't that he was so awfully moral, I guess. That explains an awful lot, too. All right. Well, we will continue with this story plus more after our next and last station identification break coming up right here, right now. Welcome back once again to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Ready to finish up our show for the day and finish out Friday, getting you ready for your weekend conversation, wherein you get to claim that you knew the news before anybody, even if that's not actually true. Well, let's see. I should also say I just was digging through Pocket for ways to end the show here. I thought it was interesting to note that Mark Sumner had a piece very similar in nature to, well, in its conclusions to the one we read from Jonathan Chait, and he actually published his first. It appeared on Daily Kos at 12:33 p.m. on Monday, August 21st, as he was getting ready for the eclipse, no doubt, whereas Jonathan Chait waited until after the eclipse to post his piece, 3:54 p.m. And so there, it's like getting New York Magazine early, at the very least. Mark ran with Russian, quote, lobbyist at Trump Tower meeting was actually asset for Russian spy services. So there you have it. The similarities are obvious, but basically all of the information, once again, drawn from the New York Times. So again, it's not Mark breaking the news, but he's got the right spin on it that the New York Times was reluctant to bring forth, and I guess Chait just took it a step or two further. Okay, so where were we here with the Icelandic bank business? Let's finish that up and see if we can squeeze in a few more stories for your weekend here. The small size of the Icelandic economy means that most people who work in the financial sector in that country know each other. And the whole country knows each other. It's small size of the Icelandic economy. Yes, Iceland's small. 300,000 people in Iceland. 100,000 of them live in Reykjavik. That's the stats I took home with me. They know one another. Anyway, oh my God, their names are going to have to be pronounced here. Ready? Björgolfur Thor Björgolfsson. Okay. That's my best guess. Björgolfur Thor Björgolfsson. Who would otherwise, let's say, uses the Thor, not just to indicate that he's very manly and all that, but I guess that breaks up the name Björgolfur Björgolfsson, sorry, which would be difficult enough. But okay, whatever. He's the wealthiest man in Iceland. And I apologize, sir, for not being able to pronounce your name properly, but maybe send me $1 million or something and I'll work on it a little bit when I see you next year. The wealthiest man in Iceland claimed that FL had been infiltrated and taken over by pro-Russian interests, Henry noted, and it sounds an awful lot like that did happen. He ended up owning about 30% of FL Group, and he claimed it had been taken over by hostile people who were channeling Russian money through it, he recalled. Another bank owned in large part by FL, remember this name? This came up too. Kaupthing had made loans to Alexander Schneider, the Russian-Canadian billionaire who financed the failed Trump Tower in Toronto, which he used, this loan, to buy a yacht. It also had other wealthy Russians on the books, among them the Smirnoff vodka magnate Yuri Shefler. I had no idea that they were still Russian, Smirnoff vodka. Ultimately, Bayrock never got that $2 billion. The global financial crisis, which eventually sunk both Kaupthing and FL Group, exposed the banks to scrutiny by regulators and law enforcement officers who aren't usually privy to the inner workings of the financial system without a search warrant. Now that the companies had to declare bankruptcy, they had to open their books. Almost as soon as they did, though, the loan books were shut. All three major Icelandic banks had three big private banking arms, and they were based in Luxembourg, Henry explained. Not the hurricane, but Mr. Henry, whose name I have, O. Henry, the candy bar guy, is who did it. Take it or leave it. When the banks failed, Luxembourg authorities went in and immediately nationalized the subsidiaries of the Icelandic banks, and they were immediately resold and privatized. By the way, nationalized it. That's amazing. We thought about that here, but of course that would be socialisms, communisms, and maybe even some Hitlerisms as well, because we're very confused about that stuff here. Putin, whose concern for the Icelandic economy was also concerned for exposed Russian oligarchs. Or I would say probably it just was that. It wasn't also that. I don't know that he had any real concern for the Icelandic economy. Anyway, he immediately became less enthusiastic about his offer of a bailout, said Henry, who'd spoken to people who tried to negotiate the loan. Of the 3 projects Bayrock planned with Trump and that FL Group allegedly wanted a cut of, the Phoenix development was completely scuttled, there's our answer, and the Fort Lauderdale hotel condo went on to lose the Trump name. But the Trump Soho was built and emblazoned with the name of the man who went on to the presidency because they had to have a launch party. That was in New York. He couldn't abandon that one, and he had already hired the models for the launch party. In his complaint, Chris contended that a confidential source said Bayrock was already awash in funds from cash accounts at a chromium refinery in Kazakhstan. We know about that one, belonging to the family of Bayrock principal Tevfik Arif, and that the firm was concealing the source of the cash. Among financiers like these, both the suit and Henry contend the FL Group was right at home. Okay, very interesting. Just wanted to sort of tie all of that together. It does raise new questions about the way in which Iceland dealt with its part of the financial crisis. Interesting. All right, let's see. Other stories, and there are a lot of them. Among the more important, perhaps, will be this one. This is going to come up, I think. Brian Beutler has a piece, believe it or not, at the New Republic, very prolific there, on the so-called exit from the White House of Steve Bannon. I think this is going to become important because we're having a difficult time, or the traditional media, anyway, having a difficult time reading what Bannon is doing here. Remember, he said, I'm not leaving Trump. I'm leaving the White House, but I'm going to go to war for Trump. And then Breitbart, which he went back to head, has since spent its time actually seeming to undermine or even just attack Trump or people still in the Trump orbit. Most famously, I would say, Jared Kushner. And so now everybody imagines, and it may be true, that Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner are at each other's throats, and that Bannon has some scores to settle with Kushner, or maybe thinks Kushner pushed him out, and he's going to use Breitbart to raise the temperature under Kushner and see if he can force him out too as some sort of revenge. Not sure whether or not that is actually what he's doing. And here's a good reminder from Brian Beutler. Steve Bannon is not your friend. It is entertaining to watch him skewer Trump's advisors, but his tactics and his vision are irredeemably deplorable. And I guess you shouldn't forget it. The crude heuristic that transformed Steve Bannon in the eyes of the media from the sewer-dwelling publisher of Breitbart's Black Crime vertical into a master political tactician, thanks to the money of the Mercers, essentially, goes something like this. Donald Trump was on pace to lose the 2016 election to Hillary Clinton before Bannon joined the campaign last August, and then Trump went on to beat her, using Bannonite race baiting and character assassination tactics with a popular vote margin of -3 million. Just as we can't replay the election to determine whether Clinton would have won if she'd done more campaigning in the upper Midwest, or if James Comey hadn't sent that letter to Congress, we will never know if Bannon provided the ballast Trump needed to eke out the narrowest of victories. But his performance as Trump's chief political advisor in the last months between the election and his unceremonious firing last week obliges us, at the very least, to rethink his reputation. The moral of Devil's Bargain, we're once again back on the new book by Bloomberg writer Joshua Green about Bannon's role in the campaign, is that Bannon's one proven skill in political combat is the creative deployment of propaganda to damage opponents of his agenda. This skill served Bannon poorly in government, but now that he has been canned and returned to his racist agitprop website, well put, it will serve the rest of us as a useful, if ultimately regrettable, reminder of how wasteful the search for worthiness or merit in the Trump-Bannon mind meld has been. Whew. After Trump won the election with his help, Bannon harbored megalomaniacal fantasies in which, after single-handedly deoperationalizing the National Security Council, He would go on to oversee the deconstruction of the administrative state. Bannon is by no means the first political operative in history to use grandiose malapropisms to impress gullible onlookers, Newt Gingrich, but he may be the most influential. And with that influence, he will return to his core competency of savaging people he perceives as enemies of his cause. On the bright side, these people are, for the moment, Trump advisors who haven't yet resigned or been fired. By the way, yes, aware of Gary Cohn and his weird justifications for staying with the administration. Not terribly interesting, but we'll put him on the record. Anyway, on the bright side, as we said, most of those people are people who haven't yet resigned or been fired, but over time, his targets will change, and he will resume the project he began years ago of increasing the reach of anti-modern, pre-Enlightenment thought in America. His ultimate goal won't be economic populism, but the fracturing and weakening of ideals and political norms that have served as bulwarks against white supremacy and other forms of illiberalism. And I think we ought to note, not all that effectively a bulwark against white supremacy, but certainly a bulwark against overt, don't worry about it, let's all be open white supremacists over the past 20 to 30 years. Not a bad thing if you can get it, considering for a long time it was open and notorious. But yeah, I think you'd get a lot of pushback on, sure, we have a great bulwark against white supremacy. No, we don't. We have a pretty thin one, and it doesn't work very well. Anyway, continuing on here, it is undeniably amusing if you don't think highly of Trump or his enablers to see the Trump loyalist media, of which Breitbart is a ringleader, take aim at the people in the White House, like National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, Chief of Staff John Kelly, and others, who serve largely to prevent the Trump administration from flying off the rails. But the subtext of Bannon's decision to air out all of his White House grievances is to delude Trump supporters into believing that the failures of the Trump presidency rest not with him, or Bannon, or even with Trump, but with the remaining coterie of White House globalists, red Jews and their allies, who serve masters other than Trump and Trumpism. As worthy as his targets are of criticism, sounded almost Minnesotan there, targets, this is ugly stuff. Anyone who monitored the 2016 election closely, that would be you people, knows the vitriol won't always be directed at people who don't deserve sympathy, nor will it ever be used to advance any worthy long-term goals. Bannon's mode of persuasion is a depraved one, deployed in the service of depraved goals, even when it's aimed at people who are depraved themselves, work for Trump. I added the last depraved bit. Even when it's aimed at people who work for Trump. Bannon's main contribution to U.S. political discourse has been to notch a victory for those who don't consider truth to be a core value. As Green notes in Devil's Bargain, this is a man who counts Nazi propagandists among his influencers, and he generally rejects the assumption that facts and reason should be principles that limit various methods of mobilizing the citizenry. Not every Republican politician in the United States has accepted Bannon's premises, and few have rejected them outright. But his influence over the party, visible most acutely in the dishonest campaign to gut Obamacare and in the widespread GOP apologetics for Trump's serial lying, has been impossible to ignore, and it is likely to last. Tactics like his would be condemnable even in the service of loftier goals, but it is notable that they are only ever deployed in the service of the worst ideas on the right. As the Washington Post's Greg Sargent has observed, Bannon could in theory use his platform to promote infrastructure investment or to fight the GOP's push to cut rich people's taxes, but instead, even in this moment of pitched infighting, he is attacking his personal enemies and defending Trump's signature race baiting. Before long, there will be new enemies, ones who aren't as unsympathetic as the likes of Jared Kushner. The fate of American democracy may well depend on millions of people resolving, sooner rather than later, that this enemy of their enemy isn't their friend. Good warning, and I think good timing on the warning, or it's good timing for us to bring it to you now. He timed it for August 22nd. Too early. You missed your moment, Brian. I don't know. I'm sure things happened during the last week that you would rather have had that perspective available. And maybe you did, because a lot of you probably do read Brian's work fairly frequently. If you missed it, you should have it. So I brought it to you. By the way, speaking of Bannon and his economic populism. Let's skip over to this one. Not news per se, but good fodder for continuing the conversation. Believe it or not, it comes from Vox. Believe it or not, it also comes from Matt Iglesias at Vox. Steve Bannon's economic nationalism is total nonsense. Yes, we knew that. Why is it total nonsense? That's the sort of thing Matthew likes to explain patiently. Trump recognizes exactly what a good con is worth. That's the subheader here. Former chief strategist and campaign manager Steve Bannon's departure from the White House surely does not mean an end to the demagogic racial politics in which Donald Trump has trafficked for decades. And they're right, it doesn't. It does, however, seem to mark the final eclipse of the notion that Trump would move beyond demagoguery and construct a vision of nationalist economic policy that would differ in a meaningful way from standard issue pro-business republicanism. Bannon, on his way out the door, appeared serious about this idea, phoning up Progressive magazine editor Robert Kuttner to try to find common ground on trade policy and explain that, quote, to me, the economic war with China is everything. Kuttner's view of why this is unworkable stems from skepticism that possible convergence of views on China trade might somehow paper over the political and moral chasm on white nationalism. Julius Krein, who tried to position himself as a rare pro-Trump intellectual, who favored the then-candidate's brand of nationalist politics during the 2016 campaign, gave up the ghost in a New York Times op-ed last week. He denounced never-ending chaos inside the administration and unforced errors, arguing that Trump's only talent appears to be creating grotesque media frenzies, just as all his critics said. Ross Douthat, as early as May, flagged indications that Trump never really believed in Trumpism himself. He doesn't have the mind strong enough, I don't think, to even form a full picture of any kind of ism. And if it's his own, well, then no one can tell him he's wrong, so I'm sure he would adhere to it. Trumpism is a real thing. I get to define it because I'm Trump. Well, it doesn't really work that way. As Ramesh Ponnuru and Rich Lowry wrote that same month, the president certainly never seems to have taken the time to flesh out what a Trumpist philosophy that would feature skepticism of trade, immigration, and foreign intervention, a moderate social conservatism, and support for government activism to benefit the working class would look like in details. The reality, however, is that economic nationalism has grave flaws as an ideology beyond Trump's racism, lack of policy knowledge, and personal indiscipline. The idea that the United States as a whole is locked in zero-sum economic competition with other countries, or that average Americans would become wealthier at the expense of foreigners, is simply wrong. Or it could become, is what he says. At best, it's an analytical error born of bias or confusion about relative versus absolute living standards. We hinted at some of this during our pre-recorded programs last week. That's when I put this aside for you. At worst, it's a con job, an effort to distract middle and working class Americans from very real questions about the domestic distribution of economic resources by casting aspersions on foreigners. The media, for understandable reasons, likes to cover controversy more than consensus. But attention to controversy can, in its own way, be misleading. And the extent of expert consensus on the economic impact of both trade and immigration is important to understand. Probably the most prominent, highly credible critique of China trade policy comes from David Autor, A-U-T-O-R, Autor, I don't know how he pronounces it, an economist whose work with David Dorn and Gordon Hanson argues that the impact of trade with China was much bigger and in some ways much more negative than experts predicted before the fact. Their argument is specifically that the impact of manufacturing on manufacturing workers and heavily manufacturing-focused communities was too big for them to successfully adjust. The result was a China shock that was large and semi-permanent rather than small and transitory as previously thought. But even if that's true, the fact remains that most Americans don't work in manufacturing or live in heavily manufacturing-focused communities, and we've benefited from trade with China. It doesn't mean the aggregate gains aren't positive. Author it's like author without the H, author, told my colleague Zishan Alim in March, your and my cost of living might be a couple $100 a year lower because of China. The problem is that these are small gains spread across hundreds of millions of people, counterposed against much larger losses for a much smaller group of people. I'll add, who would therefore feel them that much more acutely and be louder about them, and likewise find louder representation in policy circles. That's not wrong, it just is. Jonathan Rothwell of Gallup and the George Washington University Institute of Public Policy has some contrary research that says this is wrong and doesn't properly account for weak overall macroeconomic conditions in the mid-aughts. It's a fascinating and in some ways very important dispute, but both sides of the argument agree that the typical American was made better off by trade with China. By the same token, the entire bitter argument among labor economists about immigration and wages is about whether or not immigrants have depressed the incomes of native-born high school dropouts. This is another fascinating and in some ways very important dispute, but again, only 8% of the native population lacks a high school diploma. Both sides agree that most Americans are benefiting from immigration. None of that is to say that American public policy with regard to trade or immigration has been perfect over the past generation or so. Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research argues that globalization, meaning the greater integration of economies across the world, could have been designed an infinite number of ways. In particular, he argued, it could have been designed in a way that was less beneficial to the upper classes in the United States and more beneficial to the working and middle class. For example, policymakers could, and he argues should, have focused on removing professional licensing barriers to make it as easy as possible for doctors, dentists, and other highly paid professionals to train to U.S. standards and practice in the United States. These are critically important ideas to debate and consider. Globalization is fundamentally an enormous opportunity for almost everyone in the world, but the United States has, thus far, primarily taken advantage of it in order to obtain cheaper manufacturing goods for domestic consumers. That's fine as far as it goes, but fundamentally, inability to afford manufactured goods is not a big problem for more Americans. Deploying the power of globalization to make healthcare services cheaper and more convenient, by contrast, would be a huge win for the vast majority of the population. But note that just as manufacturing-focused globalization hasn't been bad for most Americans, shifting emphasis to professional services would hardly hurt foreigners. Creating broad and clear pathways for foreigners to train to U.S. standards and then move here to work as doctors, dentists, and nurses would be great for most Americans, while also creating great new economic opportunities for foreigners. All policy choices involve winners and losers, but the trade-off is almost never the kind of strict country versus country battle that Bannonism implies. The concept of economic nationalism is fundamentally a dodge. The substantive promise and political peril of re-engineering globalization is that it would alter the domestic distribution of wealth and income. Keeping doctors scarce and manufactured goods plentiful is good for doctors, and if you try to change it, the American Medical Association will try to stop you. In that sense, the economic aspects of globalization are fundamentally similar to domestic economic controversies over taxes and spending. Either you believe in trying to rewrite the rules of the economy so that the gains from growth are less hyper-concentrated among 1 or 2% of the population, or else you're not. And here, tellingly, Bannon has very little to say on this. And what he does have to say would be devastating to the interests of most Americans. When complaining in his weekly Standard exit interview that his former colleagues in the White House are going to try to moderate him, Bannon predicts that among other dire consequences, Trump will likely sign a clean debt ceiling without agreeing to the Freedom Caucus's extreme fiscal policy. This means that despite his occasional flirtations with antitrust regulation for big tech companies, he's happy to embrace draconian austerity budgets that would drastically increase child poverty and eviscerate the American educational system. To the extent that there's any heterodoxy about domestic economic policy from Bannon, It's simply an extension of culture war posturing, a way of lashing out at Silicon Valley's woke pretenses, rather than any vision of economic uplift. Possessing, as he does, the soul of a con artist rather than the pretenses of an intellectual, Trump himself is much better positioned than Bannon to recognize the full potential of economic nationalism as a useful distraction tactic, but not much more. The last section, we'll see if we can cram a bit of it in here. While Americans who follow politics were obsessing over the latest ups and downs of the Trump show this summer, real policy changes that are important to wealthy business interests continued to roll out of D.C. In late July, for instance, the Senate confirmed David Bernhardt to serve as Deputy Secretary of the Interior. Bernhardt was previously a lobbyist with the firm Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck, where he represented, among other clients, Nestle Waters. Nestle is not a particularly nationalistic group, but they do enjoy bottling water. Luckily for them, last Thursday, the Interior Department decided to reverse restrictions on bringing bottled water into national parks. The Trump administration was also hard at work last week on making it easier for nursing homes that provide substandard care to avoid legal liability, like Trump's effort to let Sinclair Broadcasting violate longstanding media concentration rules, make workplaces less safe for the people who work in them, reduce workers' overtime pay, and make it easier for financial advisors to rip off their clients. There hasn't been a lot of tweeting about those two regulatory actions. Instead, Trump feeds the public a steady diet of racial conflict, hoping that if he punches non-white America hard enough, white America will be so busy gawking they won't notice their pockets are being picked too. This is a time-honored hustle in American politics, and Trump grasps its operation intuitively. And he also grasps in a way that Bannon may not, that economic nationalism is useful as an extension of the hustle and no further. Adding immigrants and the Chinese to the scapegoat list alongside the traditional African-American targets makes for a more compelling narrative, and it lets him bring the scam to parts of the urban north that have traditionally been too overwhelmingly white for the standard race hustle to seem compelling. Bannon's pretension to constructing something larger than that failed mostly because his own interpersonal conflicts with other members of Trump's team, but there's nothing to mourn in the failure to build a more substantive vision of economic nationalism because the vision itself never made sense. That was a little dense for our way to finish up here for the day, but I don't know. I felt like it was an important part of the puzzle. I also feel like there's important parts we didn't cram in there. We'll be back with those things on Monday, and of course, a lot more along with it. It's time now for us to close things out, though. I want to tell you what's coming up next on the after show and also acknowledge that everybody came riding to the rescue to say, no, there really is a FEMA director in the wake of my comments about the onrushing hurricane, both Bill and Psychic Bubblegum. Thank you for chiming in, telling me, allegedly, Brock Long is the FEMA director, but I think we all know that's a fake name. I think the FEMA director might be a Russian bot and nothing more than that. Look out for that if that's the case, and if you're living in Texas. Get yourself prepared, get the hell out of there if you can. Don't depend on Brock Long. Is that really a name? Come on. Be honest. Okay, coming up next on the after show. Just a second here while I switch gears and find what Justice has provided for me here. I'll get as much as we can in here. After two deadly oil and gas blasts in the suburbs near Denver, GOP Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado slams special interests for pushing environmental health and safety regulations. Those damn bastards. An anti-abortion group that tried to replace Planned Parenthood in Texas loses $4 million in state funding. And a former news anchor runs for the Virginia state legislature after his girlfriend was shot dead on live TV. I remember that one. What else have they got? On the last half, 5 times married Hollywood director James Cameron says the Wonder Woman film is a step backwards for women. And the Del Oro Juice Company has been dumping orange peels and pulp in a Costa Rican national
From
park
Daily Co's Radio
since the
on
90s.
NetworksRadio.com.
And guess what happened?
You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Why it's organic material, and it revived the forest. How interesting is that? Well, get all the details on those and so many more stories on the after show. Thank you very much for batting cleanup for us every day. Wink and Justice, they will take you from here on in into the weekend. We'll be back on Monday. Thanks for listening. Live again on Monday. See you then.